I'm Emma, and welcome to TikTok Tuesday. Each week, we look at online trends and challenges and ask the experts if it's worth the hype. This week, we're looking at intergenerational trauma. The topic took center stage on TikTok after the release of Disney's Encanto. The movie follows an extraordinary family tucked away in the Colombian mountains. And underneath a plot full of magic and dancing is the story of a family still trying to heal from a horrific tragedy decades earlier. Viewers instantly picked up on the family dynamics and began sharing their own family experiences.
Okay, so in using Encanto to talk about intergenerational trauma, let's talk about Isabela. I get it if you want to villainize Abuela. Like, I get it. We're all projecting our families onto here. But Abuela Alma is a very complex character.
Wait, is this fucking play about us?
While the psychology of intergenerational trauma has been thoroughly talked about all throughout the platform, another concept has also started to regain popularity. The concept that traumatic events can actually impact the way our DNA is expressed in our own bodies. This field of research is called epigenetics, which is the study of how our own behaviors and our environments can impact the way our DNA is expressed. Some researchers even claim that these effects can be passed down through the generations. To learn more about epigenetics and this concept of intergenerational trauma, I had the opportunity to speak to Patrick McGowan, a professor of biological sciences at the University of Toronto and a known epigenetics researcher.
Thank you so much for agreeing to speak to me. I really appreciate it. So looking at this subject of intergenerational trauma, I came across your research which says that reactions to environmental stress can actually be passed down through generations. And I was wondering if you could give us a brief overview of how this happens, because it doesn't actually get passed down through your DNA, correct?
Yeah, so there are different ways in which biologists think about how inheritance can occur. And the standard way is through the inheritance of genes that are passed on from your ancestors. And these are largely unchanged across generations, and they get mixed, of course, because with each generation there's new pairings between mothers and fathers, and that changes the dynamics of the types of the ways that those genes work. But then, more recently than that, there are other mechanisms that are known as epigenetic mechanisms that are also involved in how genes work. And during development, a lot of these mechanisms come into play to make different cells into like what defines a muscle cell versus a brain cell, and what defines one organ from another. And in the brain, in terms of how the brain is set up and how it functions, these epigenetic mechanisms are really critical for defining how cells communicate with each other. And so, by extension, as they're the source of all of our differences in the way the epigenetic mechanisms ultimately are also partly influenceable by the environment. So that means that during development or even after development, certain kinds of environmental stimuli can impact those mechanisms and alter the function of cells, and we think alter behavior for the long term.
Really interesting. And do you have an example of where you've seen that happen in your research?
Well, what we looked at in some of the first studies I was involved with was the impact of early childhood abuse and severe neglect on stress. We know a lot about how the brain wires itself for reacting to stress, and we know quite a bit about how early life events like childhood abuse or profound neglect can alter that wiring for the long term. And this has huge repercussions for a lot of mental health outcomes, primarily involving mood disorders like depression and anxiety that can persist throughout the lifespan. So we looked at one important outcome related to childhood abuse, which is an increased risk for suicide. So in our study, we were able to look at the brains of individuals who committed suicide versus those who hadn't, in the context of having that history of childhood abuse or neglect and not. And so in the context of abuse and neglect, we found that the systems that respond to stress were altered in adulthood and in areas of the brain that we know are important for defining how individuals respond to stress. So this was some of the first evidence in humans that epigenetic mechanisms might be involved in the processes that wire the brain up for stress responses.
And can it affect in the other way as well? Like if you have really positive experiences, is there any evidence to suggest that that can also affect the way our brains are wired or our genes are expressed?
Yeah, it's a really important question, and that area of research is more new, but it's something that people are very interested to pursue because it's pretty obvious that there are some very simple things can protect people against those effects of stress. And what we're talking about here is not just any stress, but severe stress on the order of trauma, because there's a distinction to be made between stressors that are traumatic and stressors that aren't, because a lot of times there are stressors that are actually good for you because they help you to deal with future stressors. So not all, when I say stress, I'm not talking about stress across the board. I'm talking about severe traumatic stress. So the ways in which some interventions can help mitigate those effects of trauma are an area
Is it
of real
possible
active
that
investigation we're doing.
these epigenetic traits are passed on to the next generation?
The kinds of effects that I've been talking about are what I like to call intergenerational effects, so from parent to offspring. And there's very clear evidence that the early life parental environment influences development, and development influences the behavior and the responses of offspring throughout their lives. When it comes to what people typically refer to as transgenerational effects, that's where we're talking about effects that might persist multiple generations. And that's one of the more controversial areas of epigenetics research, because a lot less is known about how those traits or behaviors might be passed on across multiple generations. So there is some evidence from animal models that suggests that some of these epigenetic mechanisms might be contained within the sperm or the eggs and be passed on in that manner. There's a lot of other evidence that the behavior of parents is something that tends to be passed on as well. And so that can also be a mechanism that perpetuates these effects. But it doesn't mean that epigenetic mechanisms aren't involved there too. It just means that the mechanism of passing effects on transgenerationally is not necessarily through the eggs and sperm, but it can also be through the maternal environment or the maternal behavior or the paternal behavior as well.
Well, again, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to speak to me. I really appreciate it, and I wish you the best of luck with the rest of your research.
More, check us
Thank
out
you.
at healthing.ca.